In the blistering sands of Persia, where the sun scorched the earth and the winds whispered of conquest, a king rose to power with a heart as fierce as the desert itself. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, inherited an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Indus, a realm forged by his father's iron will and unmatched ambition. By 525 BC, Cambyses sat upon the Achaemenid throne, his eyes set on new horizons, his mind consumed by a hunger for glory that would soon turn to madness. This is the story of a ruler who defied gods, shattered sacred temples, and ignited a rebellion that would shake the foundations of his empire. Cambyses was no ordinary king. From his youth, he was molded in the shadow of his father's legend, trained in the arts of war and governance. Yet, where Cyrus was a unifier, Cambyses was a storm. His temper was a wildfire, unpredictable and all-consuming. The court at Susa buzzed with tales of his ferocity, how he once executed a disloyal satrap by flaying him alive, draping his skin over the traitor's own throne as a warning to others. His advisors, trembling in their opulent robes, knew better than to cross him. But it was not just men he sought to dominate. Cambyses believed he could bend even the divine to his will. Egypt, the ancient land of pharaohs, was his first great target. For centuries, it had stood as a beacon of power, its temples brimming with gold and its gods revered as untouchable. By 525 BC, Egypt was weakened, its pharaoh Psamtik III new to the throne and unprepared for the Persian tide. Cambyses saw opportunity where others saw risk. He marched his army across the Sinai, a grueling trek through blistering sands where men and beasts fell to heat and thirst. The Persian forces, bolstered by Bedouin guides who knew the desert's secrets, pressed on with relentless determination. Cambyses himself rode at the forefront, his chariot adorned with the skulls of defeated foes, a grim testament to his resolve. The Battle of Pelusium was a slaughter. Cambyses, cunning as he was brutal, exploited Egypt's reverence for cats, sacred to the goddess Batet. His soldiers herded thousands of felines onto the battlefield, shielding their advance. The Egyptians, paralyzed by fear of divine retribution, hesitated to strike. Arrows rained down, swords flashed, and blood soaked the sands. Psamtik's army crumbled, and Cambyses stormed into Memphis, the heart of Egypt. The city fell, its temples looted, its people subjugated. Psamtik was bound in chains and forced to kneel before the Persian king, who spat in his face and declared himself the new pharaoh. But Cambyses' triumph was only the beginning of his descent. In Memphis, he entered the sacred temple of Ptah, the creator god, its walls adorned with carvings older than memory. The priests, clad in white linen, warned him to respect the sanctity of the shrine. Cambyses laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed through the stone chambers. He ordered the temple's sacred bull, the Apis, brought before him. The Apis was no mere beast but a living god, chosen for its divine markings and worshipped by all Egypt. Cambyses, his eyes glinting with defiance, drew his dagger and plunged it into the bull's flank. Blood poured forth, staining the marble floor. The priests gasped, their cries drowned by the king's mocking laughter. "This is your god?" he roared, kicking the dying animal. "A god that bleeds is no god at all." The desecration sent shockwaves through Egypt. Whispers of blasphemy spread like wildfire, from the Nile's banks to the distant oases. The priests, once loyal to their new ruler, began to plot in secret. The people, who had bowed under Persian rule, now seethed with quiet rage. Cambyses, oblivious or uncaring, pressed deeper into his conquests. He dreamed of subduing the distant lands of Nubia and the mysterious oracle of Siwa, far in the western desert. His ambition knew no bounds, but his actions were sowing the seeds of chaos. In the court at Memphis, tension simmered. Cambyses' generals, hardened men who had followed him through fire and sand, began to question his sanity. His brother, Bardia, a quiet figure who had remained in Persia, was said to be a steadier hand, a man who honored the gods rather than mocked them. Whispers reached Cambyses' ears, rumors that Bardia was plotting to seize the throne. Paranoia took root, twisting the king's mind. He saw traitors in every shadow, enemies in every glance. One night, In a drunken rage, he accused his own sister-wife, Roxana, of disloyalty. Without trial or mercy, he ordered her beaten until her screams fell silent. Her body was left in the palace courtyard, a warning to any who dared defy him. The empire, vast and sprawling, began to fracture under Cambyses' iron grip. In Egypt, the priests of Ammonius, powerful and cunning, saw their chance. They spread tales of divine wrath, claiming the gods would punish the blasphemer who dared spill sacred blood. In Persia, nobles grew restless, their loyalty to the Achaemenid crown waning. Cambyses, once hailed as a conqueror, was now a king teetering on the edge of madness. His destruction of temples had not only offended the gods but had awakened a rebellion that would soon threaten to tear his empire apart. The sands of Egypt bore witness to Cambyses II's unrelenting ambition, but they also hid the growing discontent that would soon erupt into chaos. After the desecration of the Apis bull, the Persian king's grip on his new province grew increasingly erratic. The priests of Memphis, once submissive, now whispered in darkened chambers, their words laced with venom. The people of Egypt, bound by centuries of devotion to their gods, saw Cambyses not as a ruler but as a defiler. His actions, bold and brutal, had cracked the fragile loyalty of his subjects, and the first sparks of rebellion began to glow. Cambyses, undeterred by the murmurs of dissent, set his sights on greater conquests. He dreamed of crushing Nubia, the land south of Egypt, where warriors wielded spears tipped with obsidian and kings ruled from mud-brick fortresses. He dispatched an army of 50,000 men, a force that drained Egypt's resources and left his garrisons stretched thin. The march was a disaster. The Nubian desert swallowed his soldiers, their bodies buried by relentless sandstorms. Those who survived spoke of hunger so fierce they turned to eating their own dead. Cambyses, safe in Memphis, received the news with a snarl, blaming his generals for their failure. He executed the messengers, their heads impaled on spikes outside the palace gates. His next obsession was the Oracle of Siwa, a remote shrine in the western desert dedicated to Ammonius, the hidden god. Cambyses sought the oracle's blessing to cement his divine right as pharaoh, but his heart was not one of reverence. He wanted submission, not guidance. He sent another army, 10,000 strong, across the searing dunes. The men vanished, swallowed by a sandstorm so fierce it was said the gods themselves had unleashed it. No trace of them was ever found, their bones buried beneath the shifting sands. Cambyses, enraged by the loss, declared the oracle a fraud and vowed to burn its temple to the ground. In Memphis, his court became a crucible of fear. Cambyses' paranoia grew, fueled by wine and whispered rumors of betrayal. He trusted no one, not even his closest advisors. One evening, during a lavish feast, he accused his childhood friend, Prexaspes, of conspiring against him. Prexaspes, loyal to a fault, protested his innocence. Cambyses, his eyes wild, handed him a bow and pointed to Prexaspes' young son, standing nearby. "Prove your loyalty," the king slurred. "Shoot an arrow through his heart." The court fell silent, the air thick with dread. Prexaspes, trembling, aimed and fired. The boy fell, blood pooling beneath him. Cambyses clapped, delighted, as Prexaspes collapsed in grief. The act was a warning. Loyalty to the king meant sacrificing everything. The Egyptian priests, watching from the shadows, saw their moment. They began to weave a narrative of divine retribution, spreading tales that Ammonius himself had cursed Cambyses for his sacrilege. Temples across Egypt became rallying points, their chambers filled with whispered plans. The priests of Thebes, keepers of ancient secrets, sent emissaries to distant nomes, urging the people to resist. They spoke of a prophecy: a king who defiled the gods would fall, his empire consumed by fire. The people, weary of Persian taxes and brutality, listened. Farmers hid weapons in their fields, and merchants smuggled messages between cities. Cambyses, oblivious to the growing unrest, continued his campaign of terror. He ordered the temples of Sais and Bubastis stripped of their treasures, their statues of gods shattered. Priests who resisted were flogged or buried alive in the sand. In one chilling act, he had the mummified remains of a revered pharaoh, Amasis, exhumed and burned, an affront to Egypt's sacred traditions. The flames lit the night sky, and the people wept, believing their ancestors' spirits had been condemned to wander forever. Back in Persia, the empire's heartland stirred with unease. News of Cambyses' atrocities reached the nobles in Susa, who began to question his fitness to rule. His brother, Bardiya, remained a looming shadow. Some whispered he was the rightful heir, a man who respected the gods and the old ways. Cambyses, sensing the threat, sent a trusted assassin to eliminate Bardiya in secret. The deed was done, or so he believed, but the act only deepened the cracks in his empire. The nobles, unaware of Bardiya's fate, began to rally around his name, sowing the seeds of a rebellion that would soon erupt. In Egypt, the priests' whispers grew louder, their plans bolder. A man named Pechebastus, a minor noble with a fiery tongue, emerged as a leader among the discontented. He spoke in secret gatherings, his words igniting hope in the hearts of the oppressed. "Cambyses has angered the gods," he declared, "and we will be their vengeance." The rebellion was no longer a spark but a flame, spreading through the Nile's fertile lands. Cambyses, lost in his delusions of divinity, did not see the storm gathering on the horizon. The Nile ran red with whispers of rebellion, its waters carrying the weight of a land defiled. Cambyses II, now pharaoh of Egypt and king of Persia, ruled with a fist of iron and a mind unraveling like frayed rope. By 524 BCE, his empire groaned under the strain of his madness, its vast reaches trembling as the consequences of his blasphemies took root. The desecration of the Apis bull and the burning of sacred relics had turned Egypt's priests into enemies, their quiet fury spreading like a plague. In Persia, the nobles whispered of a lost prince, Bardiya, unaware that Cambyses' paranoia had already spilled his brother's blood. This was a king who mocked gods and men alike, but the gods, it seemed, were ready to answer. In Memphis, Cambyses' court was a den of fear. His soldiers, once loyal, now flinched at his every command. The king's eyes, bloodshot from wine and sleepless nights, saw treachery everywhere. He ordered purges, executing nobles and scribes on the flimsiest suspicions. One morning, a trusted cupbearer, accused of poisoning the king's wine, was forced to drink from the goblet until his body convulsed and foam spilled from his lips. Cambyses watched, unmoved, as the man's screams faded. The court learned a bitter lesson: no one was safe. Yet, even as he tightened his grip, the rebellion he had ignited grew stronger, its roots sinking deep into Egypt's ancient soil. Pechebastus, the fiery noble from Thebes, became the voice of the oppressed. In hidden groves along the Nile, he met with priests and warriors, forging alliances under the cover of night. The priests of Ammonius, with their shaven heads and eyes like burning coals, brought divine authority to his cause. They spoke of visions, a jackal-headed god, Anubis, stalking the sands, ready to judge the blasphemer. Pechebastus, no mere dreamer, turned their zeal into action. He smuggled weapons, bronze spears, curved swords and slings, into villages, training farmers and laborers in the art of war. The rebellion was no longer a whisper but a rising tide, its waves lapping at the walls of Memphis. Cambyses, lost in his delusions, planned his next conquest. He dreamed of Carthage, the Phoenician jewel across the sea, its markets bursting with wealth. But his army was depleted, his treasury drained by failed campaigns in Nubia and Siwa. His generals, scarred and weary, begged him to consolidate his rule in Egypt. Cambyses, enraged by their caution, struck one across the face with his whip, splitting the man's cheek. "Cowards!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the palace. He ordered a new campaign, conscripting Egyptian laborers to build ships along the Nile. The people, already crushed by taxes, groaned under this new burden, their resentment fueling Pechebastus' cause. In the temples, the priests wove a narrative of divine wrath. They claimed the Nile's floods were weaker, the crops thinner, because Ammonius had turned his face from Egypt. They pointed to omens: a two-headed calf born in a delta village, a swarm of locusts devouring fields near Memphis. The people, steeped in faith, believed. Pechebastus seized on these signs, declaring Cambyses an enemy of the gods. He sent emissaries to Nubia, seeking allies among the warriors who had repelled the Persian invasion. The Nubians, eager for vengeance, sent archers and spearmen, their bodies painted with ochre, their eyes gleaming with hate. The rebellion grew, its tendrils reaching beyond Egypt's borders. Cambyses, sensing the unrest, doubled his cruelty. He ordered the temple of Ammonius at Thebes ransacked, its golden statues melted down to fund his wars. Priests were dragged into the streets, their robes torn, their bodies broken under the lash. One, an elder named Menkaure, spat in the face of his captors as they bound him to a stake. "The gods see you," he hissed, before a Persian blade silenced him. His death became a rallying cry, his name whispered in every village. Cambyses, believing fear would quell the uprising, instead poured oil on the flames. The streets of Thebes buzzed with defiance, as women hid daggers in their shawls and children carried messages for the rebels. In Persia, the empire's heartland stirred with its own unrest. The nobles, hearing of Cambyses' atrocities, began to doubt his divine mandate. A mysterious figure emerged, claiming to be Bardia, the king's slain brother. This man, with a face eerily similar to the prince's, rallied support in the eastern provinces. He spoke of restoring the old ways, honoring Ahura Mazda, and ending Cambyses' tyranny. Whether he was truly Bardia or an impostor, his words struck a chord. Satraps, weary of Cambyses' erratic rule, sent gold and men to this pretender's cause. The empire, once a monolith, was fracturing, its edges crumbling under the weight of one man's madness. Cambyses, informed of the pretender, flew into a rage. He smashed his throne's armrest, splintering the cedar, and swore to march back to Persia to crush the usurper. But Egypt was slipping from his grasp. Pechebastus rebels struck at night, burning Persian granaries and ambushing supply caravans. In one daring raid, they freed a group of conscripted laborers, who joined the rebellion with homemade spears. Cambyses, desperate to assert control, ordered mass crucifixions along the Nile. Bodies hung from wooden crosses, baking under the sun, their shadows a grim warning. Yet the people, hardened by suffering, no longer feared death. They saw Cambyses not as a king, but as a beast to be slain. The rebellion swelled, a storm gathering strength in Egypt's ancient heart. Pechebastus, now a name feared by Persian garrisons, moved like a shadow, his forces striking and vanishing into the reeds of the Nile. His warriors, a mix of Egyptian peasants, Nubian mercenaries, and disillusioned Persian deserters, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. They attacked at dawn, their slings hurling stones that cracked skulls, their spears piercing bronze armor. In a single night, they burned a Persian outpost near Memphis, leaving behind a pile of smoldering corpses and a message carved into a stone: "The gods will judge." Cambyses, awakened by the news, shattered a clay tablet in his fury, vowing to drown the rebels in their own blood. The king's response was merciless. He unleashed his elite immortals, 10,000 warriors clad in scale armor, their spears gleaming like stars. They swept through villages, leaving trails of ash and bodies. In one settlement, they rounded up every man over 15, hacking off their hands before setting the huts ablaze. Women and children fled into the marshes, their cries swallowed by the night. Cambyses, riding among his troops, reveled in the carnage, his laughter mingling with the screams. He believed terror would break the rebellion, but each atrocity only sharpened the rebels' resolve. Pechebastus, undaunted, sent spies into Memphis, their faces blackened with soot, to gather intelligence on the king's movements. The priests of Ammonius, now openly defiant, declared Pechebastus the sword of the gods. They anointed him in a secret ceremony, smearing his brow with sacred oil under the gaze of a crescent moon. The ritual, held in a hidden cave near Karnak, bound the rebellion to Egypt's ancient faith. Priests chanted hymns, their voices rising like smoke, as Pechebastus swore to drive the Persians from the land. His forces grew, bolstered by defectors who whispered of Cambyses' growing instability. One general, a grizzled veteran named Artaxerxes, joined the rebels after witnessing the king strangle a servant for spilling wine. He brought with him knowledge of Persian tactics, turning the rebellion into a disciplined force. Cambyses, meanwhile, spiraled deeper into madness. He claimed visions of Ahura Mazda, the Persian god, commanding him to purify Egypt with fire. He ordered temples across the delta torched, their priests buried alive in the ruins. In Sais, he personally set flame to a shrine of Neith, laughing as the wooden beams collapsed. The smoke rose for days, a black scar against the sky. The people, watching from afar, saw it as a sign. The gods had abandoned Cambyses, and his end was near. Pechebastus seized the moment, rallying his forces for a bold strike. He planned to attack Memphis itself, to cut the head from the Persian snake. In Persia, the pretender claiming to be Bardiya gained ground. His forces captured Ecbatana, a key city, and declared him the true king. Messengers raced to Cambyses, their horses near collapse, bearing news of the uprising. The king, already stretched thin by Egypt's rebellion, flew into a frenzy. He accused his advisors of treason, executing 3 in a single day. Their heads were mounted on the palace walls, their eyes plucked out by vultures. Cambyses declared he would lead an army back to Persia, but his generals, fearing his erratic commands, hesitated. Mutiny simmered among the ranks, as soldiers whispered of joining the pretender or fleeing to the rebels in Egypt. Pechebastus, sensing the Persian forces weakening, struck a devastating blow. His rebels ambushed a Persian caravan carrying gold to Memphis, slaughtering the guards and seizing the treasure. The gold was melted down, forged into spearheads and distributed among the rebels. The victory sent a message: the Persians could bleed. Villages along the Nile rose up, their people attacking isolated garrisons with farm tools and stolen weapons. In one clash, a boy no older than 12 drove a pitchfork through a Persian soldier's throat, earning him the name Anubis Fong among the rebels. The uprising was no longer a spark but a wildfire, consuming Cambyses' dreams of empire. Cambyses, cornered by enemies within and without, turned to darker measures. He consulted Persian magi, sorcerers who claimed to wield the power of the stars. They brewed potions to cloud his enemies' minds and performed rituals to curse the rebels. One night, under a blood-red moon, Cambyses sacrificed a captive priest, spilling his blood on an altar to appease his gods. The act, meant to inspire fear, only deepened the resolve of his foes. Pechebastus, hearing of the sacrilege, declared, "No man who spills sacred blood can rule." His words, carried by runners, spread through Egypt, uniting the people in a singular purpose: to end Cambyses' reign. As the rebellion surged, Cambyses prepared for war. He rallied his remaining forces, promising gold and glory to those who crushed the uprising. But his army, battered and demoralized, was a shadow of its former might. The king, his mind a storm of rage and fear, stood on the edge of a precipice, his empire crumbling beneath him. The gods he had mocked now seemed to turn their gaze upon him, and the rebellion he had sparked was ready to strike at his heart. The sands of Egypt churned with the blood of rebellion, and the air grew thick with the stench of war. By 523 BCE, Cambyses II, the Persian king who had dared to mock the gods, stood on the brink of ruin. His empire, once a colossus, was fracturing under the weight of his madness. In Egypt, Pechebastus, the noble-turned-rebel, led a growing army of farmers, priests, and Nubian warriors, their hearts ablaze with vengeance. In Persia, a pretender claiming to be Bardiya, the king's slain brother, rallied nobles and satraps to his cause. Cambyses, his mind a storm of paranoia and rage, prepared for a final stand, unaware that the gods he had defied were weaving his doom. Memphis, the heart of Persian rule in Egypt, was a city under siege. Pechebastus rebels struck like vipers, their raids leaving garrisons in flames. They cut supply lines, poisoned wells, and ambushed patrols under the cover of night. The Nile, once a lifeline, became a battleground, its waters stained with the blood of Persian soldiers. Pechebastus, now a figure of legend, moved among his followers, his voice steady, his eyes burning with purpose. "We fight for the gods," he declared, "and for the souls of our ancestors." His warriors, armed with stolen Persian blades and Nubian spears, chanted his name, their cries echoing across the desert. Cambyses, barricaded in his palace, grew desperate. His immortals, once unstoppable, were battered by constant attacks. His generals, fearing his wrath, hid the truth. The army was dwindling, their loyalty fraying. The king, his body weakened by wine and fever, claimed divine visions, ranting that Ahura Mazda had chosen him to cleanse the world. He ordered a final purge, commanding his troops to slaughter every Egyptian suspected of rebellion. The streets of Memphis ran red as soldiers dragged men, women, and children from their homes. Bodies piled high, their limbs hacked off as warnings. Yet the carnage only fueled the rebellion, as survivors fled to join Pechebastus' cause. The priests of Ammonius, now openly allied with the rebels, wielded their influence like a blade. From Thebes, they sent runners to every nome, spreading tales of divine retribution. They claimed the gods had abandoned Cambyses, pointing to a solar eclipse that darkened the sky as proof of their wrath. The people, steeped in faith, took up arms, their fear replaced by fury. In one village, a priestess named Nefertari led a mob against a Persian outpost, her hands stained with the blood of the guards she slew. Her name became a rallying cry, her courage a spark that ignited the delta. Pechebastus planned his boldest strike, an assault on Memphis itself. His spies, disguised as merchants, mapped the city's defenses, noting the weakened gates and demoralized guards. He rallied 20,000 fighters, a ragtag army bound by faith and hate. Nubian archers, their bows strung with sinew, stood beside Egyptian peasants wielding sickles. Persian deserters, led by the traitor Artaxerxes, taught the rebels how to counter the immortals' tactics. Under a starless sky, Pechebastus led his forces through the marshes, their footsteps silent, their blades gleaming. The attack began at dawn, as rebel slings hurled stones that shattered Persian skulls, and arrows rained like a plague. The battle was chaos. Cambyses, roused from a drunken stupor, donned his armor and joined the fray, his sword dripping with blood. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, cutting down rebels with savage precision. But his forces were outnumbered, their resolve broken by months of defeat. Pechebastus, wielding a bronze spear, led the charge, his voice rising above the clash of metal. For Ammonius, he roared as his warriors stormed the city's walls. The gates fell, splintered by battering rams, and the rebels poured in, their cries drowning out the screams of the dying. Cambyses, surrounded in his palace, refused to yield. He stood in the throne room, his robes soaked with sweat and blood, cursing the gods he had once mocked. The rebels breached the doors, their weapons glinting in the torchlight. Pechebastus faced the king, his spear leveled. "You have defiled our land," he said, his voice steady. Cambyses laughed, a hollow, broken sound, and lunged with his sword. The duel was brief but brutal, steel clashing against bronze. Pechebastus drove his spear through the king's chest, pinning him to the throne. Cambyses gasped, blood bubbling from his lips, and fell silent, his eyes staring into eternity. The fall of Memphis sent shockwaves through the empire. Pechebastus, hailed as a liberator, declared Egypt free, restoring the temples and honoring the gods. But the victory was bittersweet. The city lay in ruins, its streets choked with bodies. The rebels, exhausted, knew the war was not over. Persia's vast armies still loomed, and the pretender in Ecbatana grew stronger, his claim to the throne unchallenged. Pechebastus, standing over Cambyses' corpse, vowed to defend Egypt, his heart heavy with the cost of freedom. The dust of battle settled over Memphis, but the echoes of war lingered. Pechebastus, now the unchallenged leader of Egypt, stood amid the wreckage of the Persian occupation. The body of Cambyses II, the king who had dared to slay gods, lay cold on the palace floor, his blood pooling beneath the throne he had claimed. The rebels, their faces streaked with ash and sweat, chanted Pechebastus' name, their voices a defiant hymn to victory. Yet the cost was staggering. Thousands lay dead, their bodies strewn across the city like fallen leaves. The Nile, witness to centuries of triumph and tragedy, carried the weight of their sacrifice. Pechebastus wasted no time. He ordered the temples restored, their altars cleansed of Persian defilement. Priests, their robes tattered but their spirits unbroken, performed rituals to appease Ammonius and Ta. The sacred bull, a new apis chosen with care, was led through the streets, its horns adorned with gold. The people, weary but hopeful, knelt in reverence, believing the gods had returned to Egypt. Pechebastus, crowned as a liberator, not a king, spoke to the crowds from the steps of the temple of Ta. "We have cast out the blasphemer," he declared, "but our fight is not over. Persia will return, and we must be ready." In the empire's heartland, the pretender claiming to be Bardia tightened his grip. News of Cambyses' death spread like wildfire, carried by traitors and spies. The man, whether truly Bardia or a cunning impostor, declared himself the rightful Achaemenid king, his banners raised in Ecbatana and Susa. Persian nobles, weary of Cambyses' tyranny, flocked to his side, their armies swelling with disaffected soldiers. Satraps who had once bowed to Cambyses now pledged loyalty to this new ruler, their gold and swords fueling a new empire. The pretender, his voice calm but commanding, vowed to restore Persia's glory, but his eyes turned toward Egypt, a prize he would not let slip away. Pechebastus knew the storm was coming. He fortified Memphis, rebuilding its walls with stones salvaged from Persian ruins. He sent emissaries to Nubia and Libya, seeking allies to bolster Egypt's defenses. The Nubians, their warriors still fierce from their earlier victories, sent 5,000 spearmen, their bodies adorned with scars of battle. Libya's nomadic tribes, lured by promises of gold, offered cavalry, their horses swift as the desert wind. Pechebastus trained his rebels into an army, drilling them under the relentless sun. Women, too, joined the fight, wielding slings and daggers, their courage forged in the crucible of oppression. The priests of Ammonius, now advisors to Pechebastus, wove prophecy into strategy. They declared him the chosen of the gods, a warrior destined to protect Egypt's sacred soil. In Thebes, they unearthed ancient texts, claiming they foretold the fall of a blasphemous king and the rise of a liberator. These words, chanted in temples and marketplaces, gave the people hope, binding them to Pechebastus' cause. Yet the priests also warned of a darker fate, a new Persian tide, led by a king who would not repeat Cambyses' mistakes. Pechebastus, his heart heavy, prepared for war, knowing peace was a fleeting dream. The first Persian scouts appeared on the horizon, their banners bearing the symbol of Ahura Mazda. The pretender, now calling himself Darius, led a disciplined army, its ranks filled with veterans and mercenaries. Unlike Cambyses, Darius was no madman. His strategies were cold, calculated, his ambition tempered by patience. He sent envoys to Egypt, offering peace in exchange for submission. Pechebastus, standing atop Memphis walls, burned the scrolls and sent the envoys' heads back to Darius. The message was clear: Egypt would fight. The rebels, their resolve hardened, sharpened their blades and prayed to their gods, ready for the coming storm. Years later, the tale of Cambyses' fall would be carved into stone, a warning to those who dared defy the divine. Pechebastus, whether he lived to see Egypt's final victory or fell beneath Persian swords, became a legend, his name whispered in the same breath as the gods he served. The temples, once desecrated, stood tall again, their altars lit with offerings. The Nile flowed on, carrying the ashes of the fallen and the hopes of a people reborn. Cambyses, the king who had mocked the gods, was reduced to a shadow in history, his empire fractured, his dreams buried in the sand. Egypt, scarred but unbroken, endured, its spirit a flame that no conqueror could extinguish.